Okay. So what's this going to actually add up to? Well, in order to figure out what it's worth, we have to know what it costs, and that is, I've decided to give the example here of greenhouse CHP, which is a little bit different to district heating CHP. It's actually probably a little bit more expensive to turn off a greenhouse CHP than a district heating CHP, and the reason for that is that plants require carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide comes from clean exhaust gases. They go through a catalytic converter and are fed into the greenhouse, which is necessary for photosynthesis and crop growth. So this example provides heat for the greenhouse, electricity, which is either used to power lights or is sold, and carbon dioxide. The site has a heat store. It does not have a heat dump. I've deliberately made it more awkward by removing the heat dump in this example. It does have a backup boiler which can also supply CO2, and the CHP electricity is traded in the day-ahead market. Different constructions could be put together for different power purchase agreements, but this particular one participates in the N2X auction. So what does it cost? Well, what are the drivers? Firstly, when a footroom event occurs, electricity is essentially lost. We don't generate electricity. We miss an opportunity to generate electricity. We've already sold it at the sale price, but now we have to buy it back at system buy price. And therefore, the cost of doing that is the spread between system buy and the original selling price. Now, the footroom events happen at minimum, and therefore system prices tend to be very low at that time. But nevertheless, we have to look at that. We didn't run the CHP, and therefore we saved on gas. And so essentially we sell that back to the system, and it's the opposite spread. It's system marginal price sell for giving the gas back, but the buy price stands, so it's the spread between the two. But of course, if the boiler was fired because at that time we needed carbon dioxide or indeed heat, but particularly carbon dioxide, then you don't save that gas, you still have to burn it. If you do fire the boiler, then clearly there's a question about how much space you have in the heat store. So that adds up to some constraints. If CO2 levels are affected, then we have to adjust. We have to make sure that boiler firing occurs, and that's something that has to be set up in advance, clearly. This site has no heat dump, and therefore you can't fire a boiler which produces more heat per ton of CO2 than the engine does. You have to have space for that heat in the heat store, and you have to factor in the question of electricity price risk. Now, the measures to mitigate those risks are about the duration of the event that we're willing to tolerate and the price at which we're willing to deliver at. It's not actually setting a minimum price, it's just setting a price. Putting numbers on that from real life, you can see the cost of footroom. A negative number means a cost here. If we didn't need any carbon dioxide, then the cost is different to if we did need carbon dioxide. But essentially, what it means is during red periods, during periods when the distribution networks are paying high prices for electricity on top of what suppliers pay, then footroom really shouldn't be offered. But at other times, it's of the order of a tenner per megawatt hour. Compare that to what the wind farms are being paid, 80 to 100 for onshore, well over 150 for offshore. That tells you how much profit there is to be had in footroom if it's properly constrained. Different types of footroom resource have different effects, different cost bases. District heating, the question of the cost can only be settled when we know whether or not that district heating CHP will achieve its heat load through heat stores and future rescheduling of generation, which can be done in many cases, or if it will have to make up that heat load from boiler firing. If it's the latter, then clearly there's an impact on cost. It will be less than the example I've just shown because in that case you're trying to achieve a heat target, not a CO2 target, and you fire less gas in a boiler to achieve the heat target than you do to achieve the CO2 target if your comparison is the engine. On hydro, you're looking for zero cost because you're not looking to spill. If you spill, then you're spilling at a price that actually is pretty much equivalent to an onshore wind farm, so you don't want to do that. So that limits what hydro can do, but on the other, what hydro can do, but it also means that you know that you could the cost is very competitive when you have freedom within those constraints. If it's load, well, here's a couple of examples. Pumping load. If the pumping is rescheduled, then there is no cost. On the other hand, if the pumping, you're increasing pumping by turning on an assist pump on top of a duty pump, then typically you'll find that the friction losses in the pipes go up, and that's your cost. And whether or not that's a significant cost depends very much on the geography in which that network operates, that water network operates. Something very similar sets the cost for refrigeration. Refrigeration, a footroom event, would typically be a nighttime setback on the thermostat. So we would essentially be paid to over-chill the stock. And you would do that for a few hours at night and then put the set point back to the normal position once the footroom event was over. Is there a cost in that? Well, that depends on whether or not you have coolth leakage, in other words, heat ingress, that might be increased somewhat by the lower temperatures. That's a number that can be figured out either by testing or through the basics of how that particular cold store is constructed. Either way, the cost can be known and it can be factored in dynamically on a profiled basis to ensure that the footroom events that do occur are all profitable. And that's the fundamental principle. So as I've said, what footroom is worth? Well, this is what National Grid is paying, more than £80 a megawatt hour in Scotland, that's onshore, more than £150 a megawatt hour for footroom near to the offshore wind farms. Elsewhere, where you don't have either of those two particular geographical advantages, you're talking about the lower of the two costs, where you're talking about less frequent events. So that's where we see the value going forward, the time being. This will, of course, tend to grow for the reasons that I've set out. So in summary, this has never been done before by anyone. We worked with National Grid quite hard over a long period to create this contract, and it's the most flexible contract form we've ever signed with National Grid. Nobody's committed to anything. This is a commercial service. National Grid buys it when the need is there and the price is right. There are no penalties if there are any failures. If we were to consistently fail, National Grid would consistently stop buying. So therefore, we have to succeed reasonably well in order to convince Grid that this is a good thing to buy. But with the assets that we've got coming through, I'm confident that we can do that. And of course, we wouldn't have put all this effort in if we didn't believe that. And the reason, in fact, that we can have confidence in this is that we know that the approach allows us to factor in the site-specific constraints, both the performance limits, the fundamental constraints the site must achieve core business objectives, and the fact that we can factor in any costs associated with footroom, including anything to do with the way that carbon accounting occurs on the site. Some sites have complex arrangements which mean that they have to account for their carbon tickets in a particular way. We can factor that in, and we can factor in any other things that affect the cost of delivering footroom. And that's where we come to the estimate of 15 to 35,000 per megawatt of annual revenue. And finally, while we're doing this, we are supporting renewable generation, which is the overall context in which this contract has been created. And that is all I think I should say, and I'll hand back to Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much, Alistair, for that comprehensive overview of footroom and opportunity it creates for participants.